In this video, I just wanted to briefly discuss some misconceptions about nutritional epidemiology that are common in many online diet circles. If you spend much time in the online diet and nutrition sphere, it is likely that you have encountered a concept known as the healthy user bias. This concept, as it is typically unpacked within this space, is pretty easy to understand, but as we will discuss, it's actually quite confused and doesn't really make a lot of sense. Let me explain. The idea essentially goes something like this. We've been told that, say, polyunsaturated fat is healthier than saturated fat since the 1950s, so now it's impossible to use modern epidemiology to disentangle actual effects of polyunsaturated fat, saturated fat, and any other healthy or unhealthy behavior that might correlate with either of those two variables. This sounds really intuitive and it sounds very plausible, but of course this is dumb and doesn't actually make a lot of sense given the data that we have. For example, before the 1950s, smoking was aggressively advertised for its supposed health benefits, much like polyunsaturated fat was advertised for its health benefits between the 1960s and 1970s. This could suggest that those who smoked more were more likely to engage in other behaviors that were thought of as being healthy at the time. Yet, in the 1950s, we first discovered the relationship between smoking, lung cancer, and heart disease using epidemiology. Why wasn't the so-called healthy user bias strong enough to mask the effect of smoking? To this day, there are around 300 epidemiological studies on smoking and lung cancer, and the studies that find benefits are outweighed by the studies that find detriments by about 100 to 1. Likewise, partially hydrogenated margarine was advertised as a health product because it contained polyunsaturated fat, to the exclusion of saturated fat. This could also suggest that the people who consumed the most partially hydrogenated margarine were also more health conscious, yet we see the association between trans fat and heart disease anyway. Again, why wasn't the so-called healthy user bias strong enough to mask the effect of trans fat in partially hydrogenated margarine on heart disease? It's actually quite simple. It's because these sorts of interactions between these variables would not actually produce these sorts of results given the statistical tests that are actually done in nutritional epidemiology. What these people are describing is not actually the healthy user bias at all. The healthy user bias is a real thing, but it is a completely different and unrelated phenomenon. What they are actually describing is a statistical phenomenon known as multicollinearity. This happens when multiple predictor variables end up correlating with each other in the same regression model. When the correlation is high enough, including both of those predictor variables in the same regression model will typically render the confidence intervals extremely wide. This actually makes it much harder to produce statistically significant results, let alone produce statistically significant results consistently from study to study. And this, of course, is not really what we see in epidemiology in a lot of these cases. Whether it's smoking, polyunsaturated fat, saturated fat, red meat, or trans fat, we see the associations endure despite the inclusion of other predictor variables in their respective regression models. Not only that, but we routinely find statistical significance with tight confidence intervals, not wide ones. This is evidence of independent effects between variables. This is not, however, evidence that the effects of some other variable, like physical activity for example, is masking the ostensible effects of some other variable, like polyunsaturated fat, or vice versa. In fact, that interpretation doesn't make much of any sense at all if those variables are behaving the way these people claim they're behaving. Bottom line is that if, for example, saturated fat was actually healthier than polyunsaturated fat, we likely would have found that association by now. Not only that, but we likely would have found that association consistently given the way these statistical tests work. Chalking findings like this up to an artifact produced by other measured variables, and variables that were included in the same regression model, is extremely dumb. So in conclusion, the healthy user bias, as it is typically unpacked, just doesn't make a lot of sense and is not easy to reconcile with the data that we have. Alright, thanks for watching everybody. Like always, if you like this kind of content and want to sponsor the creation of more content like this, all of the available support options are linked in the video description below, and with that, I'll see you in the next one.